The year is 1941. The Atlantic Ocean has become a graveyard. Every single day, German U-boats send thousands of tons of Allied shipping to the ocean floor. British admirals stand in their oak-paneled offices in London, staring at maps covered in red markers, each one representing a merchant ship that will never return home. The markers multiply daily, spreading across the Atlantic like a disease. Britain is being strangled, slowly but surely, and everyone knows it. The wolf packs are winning. In the smoke-filled war rooms of the Admiralty, a report lands on the desk of Admiral Sir Percy Noble, Commander-in-Chief of Western Approaches. It concerns Canada's proposal to build submarines. Not just any submarines, small coastal defense boats. The British officers read it in stunned silence. Then someone laughs. Within minutes, the entire room erupts in mocking laughter that echoes off the walls. Canada wants to build submarines? Canada, whose entire navy consisted of 13 ships in 1939. Canada, who had to borrow destroyers from Britain. The country of farmers and lumberjacks thinks they can design and build submarine hunters? One British commodore, whose name would be lost to history but whose arrogance would not, reportedly said this was like asking a child to build a battleship with wooden blocks. The Canadians were dreamers, well-meaning perhaps, but hopelessly out of their depth. The Royal Navy had centuries of naval tradition, the finest shipyards in the world, and they were barely holding the line against the U-boats. What could Canada possibly contribute? The proposal was filed away, dismissed, forgotten. The British would handle this war at sea themselves, thank you very much. But the Canadians didn't ask for permission. They didn't wait for approval. In shipyards along the St. Lawrence River, in Halifax, in Vancouver, something remarkable was happening. Men who had spent their lives building bridges and railroad cars were now building warships. Not beautiful warships, not elegant vessels that would make admirals proud. They were building corvettes, small anti-submarine ships based on a British design, but modified, improved, Canadianized. These ships were ugly, brutally functional, and they were being built at a speed that seemed impossible. The British called them toy ships when the first ones arrived for North Atlantic convoy duty in early 1941. They were small, just 200 feet long, smaller than a destroyer, barely larger than a fishing trawler. They rolled violently in heavy seas, making grown men vomit continuously for days. They were cramped, cold, and wet. Water constantly seeped through the riveted hulls, and ice formed inches thick on every surface during winter crossings. The crews were even more laughable to British eyes. Farm boys from Saskatchewan who had never seen the ocean. Store clerks from Toronto. College students. Fishermen from Newfoundland who knew boats but had never fired a weapon in their lives. Most had received only weeks of training before being thrown into the most dangerous naval warfare in history. The Germans shared the British contempt. In the comfortable officers' mess of U-boat bases in Lorient and Saint-Nazaire, the aces of the Kriegsmarine toasted their victories with French wine and champagne. They had sunk millions of tons of shipping. The Atlantic was their hunting ground, and they were the apex predators. When intelligence reports mentioned Canadian escorts, the U-boat commanders actually celebrated. Canadian escorts meant easy targets, weak opposition, more tonnage to add to their victory tallies. Captain Lieutenant Otto Kretschmer, the most successful U-boat ace in history, had a favorite joke. The Canadians were so harmless that attacking a convoy they protected was like shooting fish in a barrel, except the fish didn't shoot back. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, barely mentioned Canadian naval forces in his tactical briefings. They were not a factor in his calculations. His wolf pack tactics had already brought Britain to the edge of defeat. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Germany was sinking ships faster than Britain could replace them. It was just a matter of time. The amateur sailors in their toy boats from Canada would not change the equation. They would simply add their names to the casualty lists. September 10, 1941. Mid-Atlantic. Convoy SC-42 is steaming eastward through rough seas. 64 merchant ships, fat with cargo that Britain desperately needs. Wheat from the Canadian prairies. Steel from American mills. Timber. Aviation fuel. Food to feed a starving island. The convoy is protected by a single British destroyer and exactly 4 Canadian corvettes. HMCS Aurelia. HMCS Kenogami. HMCS Alberni. HMCS Chambly. 4 small ships to protect 64 large ones against the entire German submarine fleet. The odds are not good. The odds are catastrophic. Aboard U-85, Captain Lieutenant Eberhard Gregor raises his periscope and cannot believe his luck. The convoy is spread out, poorly organized, barely protected. His radio operator confirms at least 8 other U-boats are converging on this position. This will be a massacre. A turkey shoot. Gregor selects his first target, a 7,000-ton freighter heavy in the water, probably carrying steel or machinery. He gives the order calmly, almost bored by how easy this is. Fire 1. The torpedo races through the dark water at 40 knots, its electric motor leaving no bubble trail. It strikes the freighter amidships with a thunderous explosion that tears the ship in half. Men are thrown into the freezing Atlantic water. They have perhaps 5 minutes before hypothermia kills them. Their screams carry across the waves. The convoy erupts in chaos. Ships turn wildly, trying to avoid torpedoes they cannot see from submarines they cannot locate. Another explosion. Another ship dying. Then another. The night sky lights up with orange flames and black smoke. U-boats are attacking from multiple directions, firing and then diving deep to reload. It's chaos, it's carnage, it's exactly what the Wolfpack tactics were designed to create. Panic. But on the bridge of HMCS Chambly, Lieutenant Commander James Prentice is not panicking. He is a 32-year-old peacetime lawyer from Victoria, British Columbia. 6 months ago he was arguing cases in a courtroom. Now he commands a corvette in the middle of a U-boat attack, and he is about to make history. His radar operator, a 20-year-old kid from Montreal who learned his job from a manual because there were no instructors, suddenly shouts contact. Submarine on the surface, bearing 320, range 1,200 yards. Prentice doesn't hesitate. Full ahead. All guns open fire. The little corvette surges forward, her single 4-inch gun barking, throwing shells at the surprised U-boat. On the conning tower of U-501, corvette Captain Hugo Forster is caught completely off guard. He had been stalking another merchant ship, focused entirely on his prey, and now a Canadian corvette, a ship he had been told to ignore as harmless, is charging directly at him with guns blazing. Dive, dive, dive. His crew scrambles below, hatches slam shut, but they are too late, too slow. Chambly is coming like a freight train. The depth charges roll off Chambly's stern in a precise pattern, the result of calculations done by officers who learned anti-submarine warfare from books, not experience, but who had studied those books like their lives depended on it, because their lives did depend on it. The charges are set for 150 feet. They sink into the black water, invisible, silent. Then the ocean erupts. 4 massive explosions in sequence, each one sending a column of white water 50 feet into the air. The shock waves race outward at the speed of sound through water, faster than through air, more devastating than any surface explosion could ever be. Inside U-501 the world ends. The pressure hull cracks with a sound like a gunshot. Seawater, compressed by depth and explosive force, blasts through the crack in a jet so powerful it cuts a man in half. Light bulbs shatter, plunging sections into darkness. The electrical system shorts out with showers of sparks. The submarine is dying and Forster knows it. He has seconds to decide. Surface or die. He blows all ballast tanks, using precious compressed air to force water out, to make the submarine buoyant, to get to the surface before the ocean crushes his boat like a tin can. U-501 breaks the surface like a wounded whale, listing heavily, water pouring from her damaged hull. Forster orders abandon ship. His crew scrambles out of the hatches, many of them injured, some critically. They jump into the Atlantic wearing life vests, praying the Canadians will pick them up before the cold kills them. On Chambly's deck, Lieutenant Commander Prentice faces a terrible choice. He could fire his deck gun, sink the U-boat, kill the German sailors in the water. It would be justified, legal, even expected. But Prentice is still a lawyer at heart, and these men are surrendering. He orders his crew to cease fire and prepare to take prisoners. 37 German submariners are pulled from the icy water that night. Forster is among them, shivering, defeated, unable to comprehend what has just happened. He had been told the Canadians were amateurs, incompetent, not a real threat. Yet a Canadian corvette commanded by a peacetime lawyer had just sunk his boat in a textbook perfect attack. As he stands on Chambly's deck, soaking wet and surrounded by Canadian sailors who look impossibly young, Forster realizes that everything the Kriegsmarine had been told about the Canadian Navy was catastrophically wrong. The sinking of U-501 sends shock waves through the German submarine fleet. It's just one boat, commanders tell themselves, one unlucky encounter. An anomaly. But the sinkings continue. On September 20, 1941, HMCS Moose Jaw, another small Canadian corvette, catches U-501's sister boat U-431 on the surface and forces her down with accurate gunfire, keeping her pinned underwater until her batteries die and she must surface directly into a British destroyer's guns. The U-boat is obliterated, no survivors. In October, the Canadian corvette Levis is hunting with a British destroyer when they corner U-74. The German commander is a veteran of 20 successful patrols, an ace who has sunk over 50,000 tons of Allied shipping. He is confident he can evade or sink these escorts. He is wrong. The Canadian corvette sonar operator, a former bank teller from Winnipeg, maintains perfect contact even as the U-boat performs every evasion tactic in the manual. The depth charge attack that follows is devastating. U-74 surfaces, her back broken, and sinks within minutes. 19 survivors are pulled from the water, all of them in shock, unable to believe they were beaten by Canadians in a toy boat. November 1941. The wolf packs are growing cautious. U-boat commanders who previously attacked convoys aggressively now hesitate when they identify Canadian corvettes among the escorts. These small ships have proven to be far more dangerous than anyone predicted. They're fast enough to catch a surfaced U-boat, maneuverable enough to track a submerged one, and their depth charge attacks are increasingly accurate and deadly. Even more troubling for the Germans, the Canadians seem to have no fear. British destroyers often broke off attacks if they took damage or if the U-boat went deep and quiet. Canadian corvettes stayed on target like terriers, tracking for hours, dropping charge after charge, refusing to give up. Donitz reads the loss reports with growing concern. U-501 sunk by Canadians. U-74 sunk with Canadian assistance. U-94 badly damaged by depth charges from Canadian corvette Oakville, forced to limp back to France. U-87 sunk by corvette Moose Jaw. U-210 destroyed by a Canadian-led escort group. The list grows. These are not the harmless amateurs his intelligence officers described. These are effective, aggressive, and increasingly skilled submarine hunters. But the real shock is still to come. The winter of 1941 to 1942 is brutal in the North Atlantic. Waves reach 60 feet high. The temperature drops so low that seawater freezes on contact with metal. The small Canadian corvettes are tossed like toys, sometimes lifting completely out of the water before crashing down with bone-jarring force. Crews go days without hot food because the galley stoves cannot be used in such violent seas. Men are washed overboard, lost to the freezing darkness. It should be impossible to fight effectively in these conditions. It should be impossible to even survive. Yet the Canadians not only survive, they hunt. On a howling January night with visibility near zero and waves breaking over the bridge, HMCS Speichner detects a U-boat shadowing her convoy. The German commander assumes no escort could possibly attack in these conditions. He is wrong. Speichner turns into the mountainous seas and charges. Her bow disappears completely under green water with each wave, then rises, shedding tons of seawater, her 4-inch gun still manned by sailors who have tied themselves to their positions to avoid being swept overboard. She catches the U-boat on the surface and opens fire. The third shell is a direct hit on the conning tower. The U-boat crash dives, damaged and bleeding oil. Speichner pursues through the worst weather in the North Atlantic, maintaining sonar contact through sheer skill and determination, and delivers a depth charge attack that sends the U-boat to the bottom. By spring of 1942, the joke in British naval headquarters has died. No one is laughing at the Canadian corvettes anymore. The statistics tell a story that cannot be ignored. Canadian ships are protecting an increasing percentage of North Atlantic convoys. Losses in convoys protected by Canadian escort groups are dropping. U-boat commanders are reporting that Canadian escorts are aggressive, skilled, and dangerous. Several U-boats have limped back to base so badly damaged by Canadian depth charges that they are written off as total losses. The British Admiralty quietly issues a report analyzing the effectiveness of various escort forces. The section on Canadian corvettes is remarkable. Despite being smaller than destroyers, having less experienced crews, and operating some of the oldest and least sophisticated equipment in the Allied arsenal, Canadian corvettes have sunk or assisted in sinking 14 confirmed U-boats by the end of March 1942. 14. In less than 8 months of intensive combat operations. The same officers who mocked Canada's toy submarines are now requesting more Canadian escorts for their convoys. What the British failed to understand, what the Germans failed to understand, is that technology and tradition matter less than determination and adaptability. The Canadian crews learned faster than anyone expected because they had no choice. They didn't have decades of peacetime cruises to gradually learn their trade. They learned in combat, under fire, or they died. The casualty rate among Canadian corvettes was horrendous. HMCS Speichner, after surviving that January battle, was torpedoed and sunk in February with only 8 survivors from a crew of 85. HMCS Levis was cut in half by a torpedo in September 1941 with 47 killed. HMCS Windflower collided with a freighter in fog and sank in minutes. The losses were staggering, but the survivors learned from each death, each mistake, each near miss. The corvettes themselves improved rapidly. The early ships were essentially unmodified British designs, but Canadian shipyards quickly began making changes. Better radar was installed as it became available. The armament was upgraded with more anti-aircraft guns as the Luftwaffe began attacking convoys. The depth charge capacity was increased from 40 charges to over 70. The bridges were enclosed to protect crews from the brutal weather. Heating systems were improved, though they remained inadequate. Each modification was based on direct feedback from crews who were fighting and dying at sea. More importantly, the Canadians developed tactics that played to their strengths. They couldn't outgun a U-boat in a surface engagement. Their single 4-inch gun was no match for a submarine's deck guns and the element of surprise. So they didn't try. Instead, they used their superior maneuverability and shallow draft. A corvette could turn inside a U-boat's turning radius. She could operate in shallow water where submarines feared to go. And her small size made her a difficult target, especially at night or in rough weather. Canadian commanders developed a tactic of charging directly at a surfaced U-boat at full speed, guns firing wildly, not to sink the submarine but to panic her into diving. Once submerged, the U-boat lost her speed advantage and became a sonar contact, a target for depth charges. The depth charge attacks themselves became almost an art form for Canadian crews. Early in the war, depth charge attacks were relatively unsophisticated. Drop charges in the general area where you think the submarine might be and hope for the best. But Canadian corvettes, with their persistent, terrier-like hunting style, often tracked submarines for hours. Their sonar operators, many of them former fishermen who understood sound propagation through water instinctively, learned to interpret the echoes with uncanny accuracy. They could distinguish between a submarine, a whale, a school of fish, and a temperature layer in the water. They could estimate depth, speed, and heading from the Doppler shift of the echo. And they could maintain contact even when the U-boat went silent and tried to drift with the current. This led to devastating accuracy. By late 1942, a depth charge attack by an experienced Canadian corvette had better than even odds of at least damaging the target. The charges were set to detonate in a three-dimensional pattern that created overlapping shock waves. Even if none directly hit the submarine, the combined pressure waves could crack a pressure hull or damage critical systems. U-boats that survived Canadian attacks often reported to base with leaking seals, damaged dive planes, cracked battery casings leaking deadly chlorine gas, and terrified crews who had heard the rivets popping in their hull as the charges detonated around them. By the summer of 1942, Admiral Donitz is facing an unpleasant reality. The tonnage war is not going as planned. Yes, his U-boats are still sinking massive amounts of Allied shipping. But the replacement rate has increased dramatically. American shipyards are now producing Liberty ships faster than U-boats can sink them. And the losses among his submarine fleet are climbing. 54 U-boats lost in the first 6 months of 1942. Many of them to air attack, but an increasing number to surface escorts. And a disproportionate number of those surface escorts are Canadian. In July 1942, Donitz issues a tactical directive to his U-boat commanders. When attacking a convoy, priority targets are the merchant ships, not the escorts. Avoid prolonged engagements with escort vessels, especially small corvettes. The directive carefully avoids mentioning Canadian corvettes specifically, but the implication is clear. The toys are no longer toys. They are threats. But the Canadians are just getting started. By 1943, the Canadian Navy has grown to over 400 ships and 100,000 personnel, making it the third largest Allied navy after the United States and Britain. The majority are corvettes, improved models now being built at an astonishing rate. Canadian shipyards are launching a new corvette every week. These are not the crude early models. These are sophisticated submarine hunters with the latest radar, sonar, radio direction finding equipment, and improved weapons. The crews are no longer raw recruits. They are veterans, men who have survived multiple convoy battles, who know the U-boat tactics better than the Germans who invented them. In March 1943, the Allies established support groups, fast escort groups not tied to specific convoys but free to hunt submarines wherever they are found. Several of these groups are entirely Canadian, and they are spectacularly successful. In a single week in May 1943, Canadian escorts sink 6 U-boats. 6. In 7 days. The Germans call this period Black May. 41 U-boats are lost in that month alone, many to Canadian ships or aircraft. The most dramatic encounter occurs on May 14, 1943. The Canadian corvette Drumheller is escorting convoy OF-7 when sonar detects a submerged contact. The U-boat U-753 is stalking the convoy, but Drumheller's sonar operator has found her first. The corvette attacks immediately, dropping a full pattern of depth charges. U-753's commander, Corvettenkapitän Alfred Manhart von Manstein, is a veteran of 30 combat patrols. He knows every evasion tactic, every trick. He goes deep, kills all non-essential systems and tries to silently slip away. But Drumheller's sonar operator doesn't lose contact. Not for a second. For 4 hours, the Canadian corvette shadows the submarine, dropping charges every time the U-boat tries to move. Inside U-753 the situation becomes desperate. The air is foul, the battery's nearly dead, chlorine gas leaking from cracked battery casings. Men are passing out. Von Manstein has to surface or his entire crew will suffocate. U-753 blows ballast and rockets to the surface, her crew scrambling out to breathe fresh air, to escape the dying submarine. Drumheller is waiting. Her 4-inch gun opens fire at point-blank range. The third shell penetrates U-753's pressure hull below the waterline. The submarine settles rapidly, her crew abandoning ship. Von Manstein is the last man off, standing on the tilted deck as his boat slides under the waves. He is pulled from the water by Canadian sailors and brought before Drumheller's captain, Lieutenant Edward Simmons, a former high school teacher from Halifax. Von Manstein, dripping seawater, exhausted, defeated, asks one question. Where did you train? How long have you commanded this ship? Simmons tells him the truth. He has been in the Navy for 3 years. He took command of Drumheller 8 months ago. This is his first U-boat kill. Von Manstein can only shake his head in disbelief. 3 years. The man who just sank a 30 patrol veteran has been in the Navy for 3 years. But the story that truly epitomizes the Canadian corvette's transformation from joke to legend occurs in August 1943. HMCS Oakville, one of the smaller corvettes, encounters U-94 in the Caribbean, far from the cold North Atlantic. U-94 is a Type 7C boat, the workhorse of the U-boat fleet, with a surface speed of 17 knots, faster than a corvette. Her commander, Otto Eitz, is confident. When Oakville appears on the horizon, Eitz actually considers attacking the corvette rather than evading. One torpedo, one small escort out of action. But as Oakville closes range, Eitz notices something unusual. The corvette is charging at full speed, her bow wave white and angry, and she shows no signs of slowing or maneuvering. She is coming straight at him. Eitz realizes with horror that the corvette intends to ram. He orders a crash dive, but Oakville's captain has timed this perfectly. U-94 is still on the surface, her conning tower hatch still open, when Oakville strikes her like a hammer. The corvette's reinforced bow crashes into the submarine's pressure hull with a shriek of tearing metal. U-94 is driven sideways and down, water pouring through the open hatch. Oakville rides over the submarine's deck, her propellers churning just feet above the U-boat's hull. As the corvette passes over, Canadian sailors on her deck throw hand grenades down the U-boat's conning tower hatch. The grenades explode inside U-94's control room, killing several men instantly and starting fires. The submarine surfaces out of control, her bow rising at a steep angle, water and smoke pouring from every hatch. Canadian sailors from Oakville, armed with rifles and pistols, actually board the submarine, climbing down into the smoke-filled control room while the boat is still moving. It's hand-to-hand combat on the deck of a dying submarine. The Germans, disoriented by the explosions and smoke, surrender. U-94 is captured, though she sinks before she can be towed to port. But Oakville's crew has done the impossible. They rammed and boarded an enemy submarine in open combat and won. When this story reaches the British Admiralty, there is stunned silence. Then someone asks if it was confirmed, if it really happened the way the report described. It is confirmed. Photographs exist. German survivors confirm every detail. A Canadian corvette, one of the toy boats that the British mocked in 1941, has just captured a U-boat through ramming and boarding action. It is unprecedented. It is insane. It is magnificently, perfectly Canadian. The statistics for the period from September 1941 to April 1943 tell a remarkable story. Canadian escorts, primarily corvettes, sank or assisted in sinking 14 confirmed U-boats and damaged dozens more. But more importantly, convoys protected by Canadian escort groups had significantly lower loss rates than convoys without Canadian escorts. The presence of even 2 or 3 Canadian corvettes seemed to deter U-boat attacks. The submarines were no longer confident. They had learned to fear the small ships from the country of farmers and lumberjacks. The human cost was staggering. Over 2,000 Canadian sailors died in the Battle of the Atlantic. 24 Canadian warships were sunk, most of them corvettes. The casualty rate among corvette crews was approximately 10%, meaning 1 in 10 men who served on these ships died. But they held the line. Through 1941 through 1942, through the desperate battles of early 1943, the Canadian corvettes fought convoy after convoy across the most hostile ocean on Earth, against the most skilled submarine force ever created, and they won. By May 1943, Donitz was forced to withdraw his U-boats from the North Atlantic. The losses were unsustainable. Over 40 U-boats lost in a single month. The wolf packs that were supposed to strangle Britain had been hunted to near extinction. Air power played a role. New technology like radar and sonar helped. American industrial might provided ships and weapons. But it was the surface escorts, the destroyers and frigates and those small corvettes, that fought the day-to-day battle. And a disproportionate number of those escorts were Canadian. The British officers who had laughed at Canada's naval ambitions in 1941 were not laughing by 1943. Many of them were requesting Canadian escort groups for their convoys. Some were studying Canadian tactics and training methods. The Royal Navy, with its centuries of tradition and pride, was learning from the amateurs, the civilians in uniform, the farm boys and store clerks who had become some of the most effective submarine hunters in the world in less than 2 years of brutal combat. German U-boat commanders who survived the war and were later interviewed spoke with respect about their Canadian opponents. Several mentioned that Canadian escorts were more aggressive than British or American ships. They stayed on target longer. They didn't break off attacks easily. Some U-boat survivors said they feared Canadian escorts more than any others because Canadians seemed to take submarine hunting personally, as if each U-boat represented a threat to their home, which in a sense it did. Canada's economy depended on Atlantic shipping. Every U-boat in the North Atlantic was a direct threat to Canadian interests. The corvette crews understood this viscerally. The technology improved throughout the war. By 1944, Canadian corvettes carried Type 271 radar that could detect a surface submarine at several miles range even in darkness or fog. Their sonar was sophisticated enough to track submarines in conditions that would have been impossible in 1941. They carried Hedgehog mortars that fired contact-fused projectiles ahead of the ship, allowing attacks without losing sonar contact. They had radio direction finding equipment to locate submarines making radio transmissions. They were no longer simple depth charge platforms. They were sophisticated submarine hunters. But the real advantage was never technology. It was the crews. By 1944, a typical Canadian corvette crew averaged 18 months of combat experience. The captain might be 26 years old, a lawyer or teacher or accountant in civilian life, but he had fought his ship through a dozen convoy battles. The sonar operator might be a former fisherman who could interpret echoes with supernatural accuracy. The depth charge crews could reload and prepare for another attack in under 2 minutes. These were not amateurs anymore. These were professionals forged in combat, survivors of a learning curve that killed 1 in 10 of their comrades. The war ended in May 1945. Germany surrendered. The U-boat fleet, what remained of it, surfaced and sailed to Allied ports to surrender. The Battle of the Atlantic was over. The Allies had won. Britain had not been starved into submission. The convoys had gotten through. And a major part of that victory belonged to the small ships and their crews that everyone had underestimated. After the war, historians and military analysts studied the Battle of the Atlantic extensively. The consensus was clear. The battle had been won by a combination of factors. Long-range air patrol closing the mid-Atlantic air gap. Improved technology, especially radar and sonar. Breaking the German Enigma codes allowing convoy routing to avoid wolf packs. The sheer industrial might of American shipbuilding. And aggressive, skilled surface escorts that made submarine operations increasingly dangerous and ultimately unsustainable. Canadian corvettes were specifically mentioned as a critical factor in the escort equation. Their numbers, over 300 corvettes eventually built, provided the mass necessary to protect the massive convoy system. Their effectiveness provided the quality. Together, mass and quality had defeated the U-boat threat. The final accounting is remarkable. Canadian warships escorted over 25,000 merchant ships across the Atlantic during the war. They fought in over 700 convoy battles. They sank or assisted in sinking dozens of U-boats, the exact number still debated by historians but certainly more than 30 confirmed kills. They rescued thousands of survivors from torpedoed ships, often in conditions that made survival itself seem impossible. And they lost approximately 2,000 of their own, young men who never came home from that cold, dark ocean. There's a memorial in Halifax, Nova Scotia, overlooking the harbor where so many convoys formed up before heading into the Atlantic. It lists the names of the Canadian sailors who died in the Battle of the Atlantic. The list is long, covering multiple walls. Many of the names are followed by a single word: missing. Their ships were sunk so quickly in such deep water or such remote locations that their bodies were never recovered. They remain at the bottom of the Atlantic, entombed in their corvettes, forever young, forever on patrol. The British generals who laughed at Canada's toy submarines never publicly apologized. There was no formal acknowledgement that they had been catastrophically wrong in their assessment. But the records show a quiet shift. By 1943, British convoy commodores frequently requested Canadian escorts. British tactical manuals incorporated Canadian-developed techniques. And in the post-war naval histories written by British authors, there is consistent praise for the Royal Canadian Navy's contribution to the Battle of the Atlantic. The laughter had stopped. The German U-boat commanders, interviewed years later, spoke with something approaching awe about the Battle of the Atlantic. Many of them mentioned Canadian escorts specifically. One commander, whose name I will not glorify by repeating, said that he learned to recognize Canadian corvettes by their silhouette and their behavior. They were smaller than destroyers but more aggressive. They would pursue a contact for hours, long after other escorts had given up. He said his crew became anxious whenever a Canadian corvette was detected because they knew they were in for a long, brutal fight. Another U-boat survivor stated simply that Canadian escorts had cost him more sleepless nights than any other Allied naval force. The corvettes themselves had short service lives after the war. Most were scrapped within a few years. They had been built quickly, built cheaply, and they were worn out from years of hard service in brutal conditions. A few were sold to other navies. One or two were preserved as museum ships. But the vast majority went to the breakers' yards, cut up for scrap metal, their steel recycled into peacetime products. It seems an undignified end for ships that had fought so hard and achieved so much. But the legacy remained. The Royal Canadian Navy that emerged from World War II was a professional, capable force that had earned respect through combat performance. The lessons learned in the Battle of the Atlantic influenced Canadian naval doctrine for decades. And the spirit of those corvette crews, the determination and adaptability and refusal to quit, became part of Canadian military identity. Today, when naval historians analyze the Battle of the Atlantic, Canada's role is no longer footnoted or minimized. It is recognized as essential. Without Canadian escorts, the convoy system would have been unsustainable. Without Canadian shipbuilding, there would not have been enough escorts. Without Canadian sailors, thousands more merchant ships would have been sunk and Britain might have been forced to negotiate a peace. The toy submarines that British generals laughed at in 1941 had helped win the most important naval campaign of World War II. The 14 U-boats sunk in those first critical 8 months of intensive Canadian operations, from September 1941 to April 1942, represented more than just statistics. Each sinking removed an experienced U-boat crew from the battle. Each damaged submarine spent months in port being repaired, months when it couldn't attack convoys. More importantly, each encounter with aggressive, effective Canadian escorts made all U-boat commanders more cautious. Fear is a weapon, and the Canadians had learned to wield it effectively. The hunters had become the hunted. There's a saying among historians who study naval warfare: amateurs study tactics, professionals study logistics. The Battle of the Atlantic was ultimately won through logistics. The logistics of getting enough ships to sea. The logistics of building them fast enough and cheap enough. The logistics of training crews quickly and effectively. And the logistics of sustaining operations over years of brutal combat in the worst ocean environment on Earth. Canada excelled at all of this. Canadian shipyards built corvettes faster than anyone thought possible. Canadian training programs turned civilians into effective naval crews in months. And Canadian sailors sustained operations through conditions that broke men and ships. The British admirals who laughed had made a fundamental error in judgment. They confused tradition with capability, polish with effectiveness. They assumed that because Canada lacked a long naval history, Canadian sailors would be inferior. They failed to understand that determination, adaptability, and willingness to learn could overcome lack of experience remarkably quickly when survival depended on it. And they underestimated the Canadian character, the stubborn refusal to quit, the willingness to endure hardship without complaint, the quiet competence that doesn't need to announce itself. By the time the British realized their mistake, Canadian corvettes were already proving themselves in combat. By the time the Germans realized the threat, it was too late. The mass production of corvettes had given the Allies numerical superiority in the escort war. The rapid improvement in Canadian tactics and training had given them qualitative competence. Together, these factors turned the tide. The story of the Canadian corvettes is not a story of brilliant strategy or revolutionary technology. It's a story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things because they had no choice. Farm boys from the prairies learning to hunt submarines in the North Atlantic. Store clerks from Toronto becoming expert sonar operators. College students commanding warships in combat. Fishermen from Newfoundland teaching naval officers about reading the sea. These were not professional warriors. They were civilians who put on uniforms when their country called and then performed at a level that stunned their allies and terrified their enemies. When you study the Battle of the Atlantic in detail, certain patterns emerge. In the early months, 1939 and 1940, the U-boats dominated. Merchant ship losses were catastrophic and escort forces were overwhelmed. In 1941, the balance began to shift. More escorts, better tactics, improving technology. In 1942, the battle hung in the balance. Losses remained severe but convoys were getting through. In early 1943, the crisis point. The Germans threw everything into a final bid to win the tonnage war. And in May 1943, the collapse. The U-boats were withdrawn, defeated. Canadian corvettes were on the front lines during every phase of this battle, but their impact was greatest during the critical years 1941 to 1943, when the outcome was still in doubt. The official British naval history of World War II, written by Captain Stephen Roeskill, dedicates substantial space to Canadian naval operations. Roeskill, a British officer who had been critical of Canada's early naval performance, wrote with genuine respect about the transformation he witnessed. He noted that Canadian escorts in 1941 were often poorly equipped and their crews inexperienced, but by 1943 they were among the most effective submarine hunters in the Allied arsenal. He attributed this to aggressive leadership, intensive training and combat experience. He also noted, somewhat ruefully, that the Royal Navy had underestimated Canada's potential contribution and had been proven wrong by events. German records captured after the war provided additional perspective. Donit's war diary contains multiple references to Canadian escorts. In early 1941 they are barely mentioned. By late 1942, there are specific tactical instructions regarding Canadian escort groups. By 1943, there are frustrated entries noting that attacks on convoys protected by Canadian escorts resulted in disproportionately high U-boat losses. The recognition is grudging but clear. The Canadians had become a serious problem. Individual U-boat war diaries are even more revealing. Commanders who encountered Canadian corvettes in 1941 and survived to write about it often expressed surprise at the aggressive tactics and accurate depth charge attacks. By 1942 and 1943, the tone had changed to respect and sometimes fear. One commander wrote that being hunted by a Canadian corvette was like being pursued by a terrier that would not let go. Another noted that Canadian escorts seemed to have an uncanny ability to maintain sonar contact even when the U-boat employed every evasion technique. Several mentioned that Canadian depth charge attacks were more accurately placed than British or American attacks, though they could only speculate why. The answer was likely the quality of Canadian sonar operators, many of whom had backgrounds that translated well to submarine hunting. Fishermen understood sound propagation through water. They understood how temperature and salinity affected sonar returns. They could distinguish between echoes from biological sources and mechanical sources. And they had the patience to track a contact for hours, maintaining concentration through cold, exhaustion, and fear. This was not something that could be easily taught in a classroom. It was intuitive knowledge combined with intensive practice under actual combat conditions. The depth charge crews developed their own expertise. Loading and setting depth charges is dangerous work. Each charge contains 300 pounds of high explosive. A mistake can kill the entire crew. But Canadian corvette crews became incredibly efficient. They could set fuses for specific depths, load charges onto throwers and rails, and prepare for sequential drops in under 2 minutes. This speed allowed for rapid follow-up attacks, giving the submarine no time to maneuver between patterns. It was this relentless pressure, attack after attack after attack, that broke the nerve of many U-boat crews and eventually broke their ships. The officers who commanded Canadian corvettes were a remarkable group. Many had no prior naval experience. They came from law, education, business, engineering. They learned ship handling from manuals and from more experienced officers during brief training periods. Then they took command and learned the rest through experience. The casualty rate among corvette commanders was high, but those who survived became extraordinarily skilled ship handlers. They had to be. A corvette in heavy seas required constant attention. A moment's inattention could result in the ship broaching, turning beam on to the waves and potentially capsizing. In combat, ship handling was even more critical. Positioning for a depth charge attack required precise timing and positioning. Too slow and the submarine escaped. Too fast and you overran the contact and lost sonar tracking. The sweet spot was narrow and it changed with every attack depending on submarine depth, speed, heading, and sea conditions. Canadian corvette commanders developed a reputation for aggressive, sometimes reckless tactics. The ramming attack by HMCS Oakville was extreme but not unique. Several Canadian corvettes deliberately rammed submarines when the opportunity presented itself. This was not standard Royal Navy doctrine. Ramming risked serious damage to the escort, potentially putting her out of action. But Canadian commanders calculated that the certain destruction of a U-boat was worth the risk of damage to a corvette. This calculus reflected a fundamental difference in approach. The Royal Navy tended to view escorts as valuable assets to be preserved. Canadian commanders viewed escorts as expendable weapons to be used aggressively. Both approaches had merit, but in the desperate battles of 1942 and 1943, aggression often won. The end of the war brought rapid demobilization. The massive Canadian Navy, third largest in the world in 1945, shrank quickly. The corvettes were paid off, their crews discharged to return to civilian life. The transition was often difficult. Men who had commanded warships in combat at age 25 found themselves back in civilian jobs with no recognition of their wartime service. Canada in 1945 wanted to forget the war and return to peacetime normalcy. There were no victory parades for corvette crews, no monuments erected in their honor. They simply went home and resumed their interrupted lives. Decades passed before their contribution was fully recognized. In the 1970s and 1980s, historians began seriously studying Canada's naval role in World War II. Books were written, documentaries produced. Veterans were finally interviewed about their experiences. And a picture emerged of a naval campaign that had been critical to Allied victory but had been overshadowed by more glamorous operations like Normandy or the Pacific Island campaigns. The Battle of the Atlantic lacked the drama of amphibious assaults or carrier battles. It was a long, grinding, brutal campaign fought in terrible conditions against an enemy that struck from beneath the waves and then vanished. But it was absolutely essential. If the Atlantic convoys had been cut, Britain would have fallen and the entire course of the war would have changed. The Canadian corvettes and their crews had held the line during the critical years. They had transformed from toys and jokes to respected, feared submarine hunters. They had proven that determination and adaptability could overcome lack of experience. They had shown that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when necessity demanded it. And they had won respect from their allies and enemies through performance in combat, not through tradition or reputation. Today, naval historians universally recognize the importance of Canadian corvettes to the Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic. The Royal Canadian Navy's contribution is no longer footnoted or minimized. It is acknowledged as essential. The story of the corvettes has become a point of pride in Canadian military history. And the veterans, the few who remain, are finally honored as they should have been 70 years ago. The British generals who laughed learned their lesson. The German U-boat commanders learned theirs at far greater cost. And history learned that underestimating Canada, whether in 1941 or at any other time, is a mistake. The country of farmers and lumberjacks had built a navy from almost nothing, had manned it with civilians, had sent it into the most dangerous waters on Earth, and had won. The toy submarines had sunk the wolf packs and saved the convoys. The laughter had died in the cold waters of the North Atlantic, along with thousands of brave men who had proven everyone wrong.